Hi everyone, welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast, where we focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing organizational change effectively. Our guests cover a diverse number of critical topics to enable positive change, including communication, leadership, training, change practice, process design, change capability, and much more. In this episode, my guest is Andrew Gerkens, a great and curious mind when it comes to organizational culture, development, strategy, and capacity. With an extensive experience in helping organizations build and sustain capability and performance, Andrew is a thought leader in organizational capacity to deliver, adapt, transform, and grow. It's a privilege to have Andrew join the Inner Game of Change podcast. Well, Andrew, thank you for your time and welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast.
Thank you so much, Ali. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. And Andrew, the topic today is about adaptive cultures and how that can help build the capacity for sustainable change. You've always been interested in talking about cultures. Is this a new interest or has it always been at the back of your mind?
A little bit of both, I think. I've always done culture work. I've always been interested in culture. But if I'm completely honest, I never felt entirely comfortable with culture because I didn't really have I knew it was important, but I didn't necessarily have a clear understanding of how to influence it. I knew the work that I was doing was about enhancing culture and would have a positive impact on people and performance. But the culture piece always felt really vague. And for many years, my focus was very much around organizational capability and, using tools like performance consulting and capability ecosystems. So very much this performance lens. But a few years ago, I really got introduced to the idea of adaptive challenges and how they're different to technical challenges and how the performance lens that had been so useful to me, so helpful to me, was still relevant, but I needed to look more broadly, and I guess I needed to broaden my worldview in order to make a real difference. And that's where I came across an organisation called Adaptive Cultures, which was founded by Alison Cameron and Andrew Brown, and that really got me onto the path of proudly standing up and saying that I'm a culture practitioner, and it's had a significant impact on how I see the world, how I approach my work, and I think my ability to make a real difference in the work that I do and the people that I support.
Fantastic. And look, Andrew, we talk a lot about culture and we hear about it all the time. But first of all, what is culture? And a second thing, how do you approach it?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I think culture, like strategy, like change, are terms that get thrown around all the time and everyone nods their head, but we never take a moment to say, are we talking about the same thing? And I think as well, we're used to the media where culture is a headline, and often that headline is about culture being the blame. And we've had a number of examples in certainly Australian business and sport in recent times where when performance was bad or unacceptable, culture was blamed. But no one ever unpacks the headline to say, well, what exactly was it about the culture that was to blame? And then likewise, we hear about, in employers of choice and all these, fantastic organizations and how the culture is the key to their success. But we never really get an understanding of, so what is it about the culture? Is it some kind of secret sauce? So I think a really simple thing that I would encourage every leader and practitioner out there to do is just take some time to clarify, when we talk about change, what are we talking about? When we talk about culture, what is it we're talking about? And the really simple thing that's come up with leaders that I work with is they very quickly come around to the idea that culture is how things get done around here. And I love the simplicity of that term, but I love the richness that comes with unpacking that. And what I'll normally do with people is to say, absolutely, how things get done around here but because we're leaders, because we're the stewards of the culture, we can go a bit further. So we don't just want to understand or diagnose how things get done. We also want to understand, why do they get done that way? What's the reason for that, or what are the drivers of that? And also, what are the things that might be inhibiting alternatives? What are the things that might be blocking us or blocking people from doing things differently and thinking differently? And that's where we start to develop a curiosity about culture that can really help us understand the enablers and the inhibitors, the healthy and the unhealthy aspects of culture.
Andrew, is the term adaptive culture, does that also mean, is learning culture part of being adaptive?
It is. But I suppose, and we can talk about this a little bit further, I suppose, but one of the things that's really helped shape my approach to culture is the fact that we often think of culture as an ideal, and likewise, when we talk about learning culture, it's often seen as an ideal. But for me, it's important to link our aspirational culture with our strategy. What does our strategy ask of us? If we had a strategy that suggested that we need 5 new production facilities, we wouldn't build 10 because we only need 5. And I think if we think about the idea of culture is capacity, culture is our capacity to deliver our strategy. Culture is our capacity to respond to change and disruption. And culture represents our capacity to grow. So there's an element of aligning our aspirational culture with what our strategy is demanding of us, and what the environmental challenges, the headwinds that we might be facing. It's about aligning our aspirational culture into those headwinds. The adaptive part is ultimately a reflection of our capacity to navigate complexity and uncertainty and volatility and ambiguity. And I haven't done it in the right order, but that's the VUCA world that everyone talks about.
Yes. Yeah.
So when we talk about adaptive capacity, it's actually a reflection of our capacity to navigate that sort of terrain.
Right.
We can have earlier stages of culture where we don't really have that capacity. So it's only later stages of evolution where we're really building the capacity within our leaders, within our systems, within our processes, so that we can survive and thrive in that environment.
Yeah, look, and I think a typical example is what happened in 2020 and still happening. The impact of working remotely. How do you think that will shape up the new cultures going forward?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I think many organisations weren't prepared and reacted, and a smaller number were in a better position and responded. And there's lots of reasons for that, but it would be fascinating to unpack, to understand why some were better prepared than others. And you'd argue that some of that would have been had they built the capacity to respond rather than react. But certainly so much learning coming from the experience of 2020 and continuing this year. So I think there's the opportunity for organisations. I think one of my observations is that many organisations have ramped up, virtual team spaces and technology, but have they really done the deeper work to ensure that people can perform and continue to respond? So implementing new technology in isolation doesn't guarantee the result. So I think there's a lot of deeper work that needs to be done to evolve ways of working, ways of communicating, not just giving people another piece of technology and thinking that it's all going to be okay.
And what's the role of the leadership in creating those adaptive cultures? I mean, my expectations is that those cultures are led by leaders, or the leaders create the appropriate environment for an adaptive culture to grow.
Yeah, and I think perhaps, Ellie, if I can take a step back, we defined culture quite simply as how things get done around here, an understanding of why, and an understanding of the things that might be inhibiting alternatives. One of the ways that I build on that to engage leaders and to really, to give them ownership of their role in evolving culture is, it's one thing to understand what culture is, but I think that one of the biggest challenges that we come up with all the time is that leaders then say, now what? I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do. We want to evolve the culture. We want more performance or more inclusion or more collaboration. We want to be more responsive to customers. I'm just not sure what to do. And so one of the simple things that I talk about with leaders, and I use an analogy of a profit and loss. If I'm a manager in a business and I'm managing a P&L, if the numbers aren't quite right, then we talk about what levers can the manager pull to tweak that number to get the P&L heading in the right direction. And so the levers that a manager might pull might be a labour lever. Do I need to look at overtime? Do I need to look at my use of casual labour? There might be an infrastructure lever. I might need to look at equipment leasing and things like that. So the analogy of a P&L and pulling levers to tweak the result is a perfect one for culture. And the three levers that we talk about using the adaptive cultures methodology are individual transformation, social transformation, and structural transformation. So if I want to evolve my culture and build a more adaptive culture, build our capacity to deliver, adapt, and grow, then they're the three levers. And when I talk about it with leaders, I'm confusing my levers and leaders here. When I talk about it with leaders, I normally start with the structural lever. So if we've defined what culture is, and we talk about the idea of an aspirational culture, and then we introduce the levers, I normally start with the idea of the structural lever. And I will talk about if we build a new head office in a different location, will that influence how things get done? Will that change how things get done in this organisation? And of course, people say yes. And so then I often make a light of it and say, so you hadn't thought about a new building as a culture intervention, had you? And then likewise, I say, if we implement a new system, a new sales platform or a new human resource information system, that's going to influence how things get done. That's going to change the way things get done. That's a culture intervention. So in the structural lever, it's nice and tangible. So I find that leaders aren't normally thinking about those things with culture. So it's a great way for them to suddenly latch on to the idea that, wow, infrastructure, systems, processes, strategy, they're tangible things that we can influence in order to evolve how things get done. The social lever is quite similar and one that more people would be familiar with when they think about culture, because it's what we communicate, how we communicate, when we communicate, the language we use, our operating rhythms, our rituals. All of those things have a big impact on how things get done. If we change our meeting structure, that's going to have an impact. Yeah. And then the final one is the one that's most common and most people would associate with culture, and that's the individual lever. And of course, that's where we look at things like leadership, values, decision-making, competencies and capabilities. And so all of those things, that individual lever is another option for us to evolve the way things get done. And any combination of those is what's available to us to make conscious choices about how we evolve the culture in order to build our capacity to deliver on our strategy or respond to market forces or to respond to disruption.
Yeah, great explanation. And I really like the analogy because that can resonate with the business. I think it's been a long time, and businesses have got really good ability to use the levers for financial, performance uplifts. But when it comes to culture and all of those things, it's probably far more complex than that, or it's put in the too hard basket, and then we move on with our life.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that using that analogy of the levers, a big part of this, coming back to your question about leadership, the idea of building adaptive capacity is very much centered around liberating agency. We want people to take responsibility and to be committed to the idea of cultural evolution. So the opportunity for leaders to, one, have clarity around what culture is and how it connects to strategy, and then to see that they absolutely have the power and the opportunity to deliberately do this work, to consciously do this work. And if they can do that, and through that process, unlock the potential of others to take responsibility, then that's when we really get momentum.
I've heard you a couple of times talking about culture evolution, the idea that let a culture evolve rather than go in there and try to change a culture. Is there a reason for that? Does that mean that when you let a culture evolve, that it's far more sustainable?
Yes, I think so. And I think there's a few reasons for that for me. I think one is, the language of change itself. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the language of change can be limiting. People can feel that there's something wrong or there's something broken. Likewise, the language of change often relates to, we use a burning platform to build momentum, but that can also be limiting. And I think change often, even though we can talk about change being continuous, I think people will often feel that this is a change initiative and there'll be an end point and it'll be done. I think the idea of evolution, I think people are more likely to be open to the idea of evolution rather than some of the hard and potentially threatening aspects of change. But likewise, if we think about the world around us, it continues to evolve, and our organisations need to evolve as well. So what we did yesterday, how we did it yesterday, may not help us do the work tomorrow. So how can we use the idea of evolution as a continuous process to build people's awareness and to build their commitment? So it's not a change that's going to get done and then we're finished and we can sit back. It's actually, this is a continuous process. We also, through the adaptive cultures framework that I've been utilising and found really valuable, we actually talk about different stages of evolution. And so it's a really useful frame to help people think about where their organisation is now, where it needs to be, and of course that's anchored in strategy. So we can talk about impulse-oriented pre-culture organisations that we might normally associate with entrepreneurial startups. And then at some point, they're going to get a little bit bigger and they're going to start to slow down and have growing pains. And so they'll recognise that they need to evolve. They don't have the systems and the processes they need. They don't have the role clarity they need. So then they might start to evolve towards a compliant dependent culture that has a really strong compliance focus and a high level of dependence. And the healthy aspects of that compliant dependent culture will be the role clarity and the system and process disciplines. And then at some point, those organisations, due to a range of factors, might start to recognise that they need to evolve. And so they might start to professionalise and to be more driven and results focused. And so that's when they might start to move towards the space of high-performing teams, which we would refer to as an achievement culture. And, of course, then we move into stages where we really start to build adaptive capacity, and that's our collaborative growth culture and our co-creation culture. And getting back to the question you asked earlier about learning or leadership, we can talk with people about what does learning look like in a compliant dependent culture? And then how might that evolve, and what might learning look like in an achievement culture? And we can say the same thing about leadership. We can talk about compliance. We can talk about what's important to the organisation. So all of those things evolve as the organisation evolves. And the idea is that we want to keep all of the healthy aspects of the previous stage of evolution. We want to keep all the healthy aspects of a compliant dependent culture, include those, and then transcend to then embrace all the benefits of an achievement culture. And all of that, of course, is anchored in what's our strategy, where do we need to be, how do we align that culture to ensure that we've got the capacity to deliver.
Well said, well said. Another common challenge is that leaders see culture, and this is the accountability piece. Leaders see culture as belonging to the people and culture function. Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think it's often anchored in the fact that people and culture own the culture survey, and the culture survey is done religiously on an annual basis or every 2 years, and that's useful. But it's often driven by the fact that that's the cycle that suits us. But I think the risk of that can be that it's often seen as separate to strategy work and separate to the work of leadership. And so I'm not questioning the intentions, but I think it often reinforces this idea that the culture is separate to the strategy work. I think likewise, there are lots of surveys that are called culture surveys, but actually they're climate surveys, they're engagement surveys. And I think there's an important difference. A true culture diagnostic diagnoses the culture, diagnoses the system, explores how things get done. But many surveys that organisations do, even if they're branded as culture, will be climate surveys. They're measuring people's response to the system, and in the ideal world you would have both. But the culture diagnostic truly diagnoses how things get done, and if we can better and more intimately connect that to strategy, then we've really got a clear purpose for culture, and we can bring it back into that space of leaders being the stewards of the culture and taking on responsibility rather than relying on people and culture to administer a people and culture process.
Yes, and how effective do you think, and we're talking about the surveys and engagement surveys, and I think you also called some of them a climate survey. How effective, from your experience, how effective are organizations at responding to those surveys and actually taking effective steps to make some changes based on the survey?
Yeah, it's a tough one because I absolutely cannot fault the intention. I think the intention is always really good, and I think people and culture take pride in facilitating these surveys, drawing out insights, running action planning workshops, and really doing their best to empower leaders. But I think sometimes there's a limit to their effectiveness because, as I said, I feel that they're often perceived to be important, but separate to strategy and separate to the work of leadership. So I think there's a lot of effort, there's a lot of busy work, but I'm not sure that the results are always there. And I'm probably sounding a little bit cynical, but I think there are some limitations to the way culture diagnostics are used in organisations at the moment. Yeah. And like anything, there might be a survey that's really helping us right now, but that doesn't mean that we need to do it forever. What helped us over the last 2, 3, 5 years might not be the appropriate tool for helping us evolve our culture over the next 2 to 3 years. So nothing's forever. So like anything, we should be looking at, do we have the right tools that are helping us get the right insights, that are helping us adapt the system and evolve our culture.
Yeah, no, look, I find it curious that by the time we, complete the survey, then we get the data, then we get some insight, and then we put action plans. There's a time lag. And by that time, the culture, knowing how dynamic the organizations are now in the market, the culture would have already shifted, wouldn't it?
Well, technically, yes, but I suppose it depends. And let's face it, there might be some long-term work as well as quick wins.
Yeah.
I think the danger with engagement surveys and climate surveys too is there's lots of busy work, but it's about responding to people's reactions to the system as opposed to diagnosing and evolving the system. So I think engagement surveys, they can produce some good results for us, but there's a lot of busy work, and it might not always be the right work or the best work.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge. I don't quite know the answer, but in the ideal world, we'd have a healthy balance of both. even if we adapted the tools over time to help us ask different questions and to challenge us to think differently.
Yeah, which takes me to the I think whatever actions we want to connect and we want to take is going to have to be aligned with the strategy. Connecting culture with strategy is important, but how do you approach it?
Yeah, and I think this is where I've been really fortunate in the last few years that I've had some amazing opportunities to put this into practice, and I think that's I've probably had my most significant learning in the last few years. And so one of the keys for me, most of my background is L&D, organisational capability, organisational development, and I was always very conscious as an HR practitioner not to be going around the business and trying to say, hey, we've got some great stuff for your people, or hey, we've got all this learning stuff for your people, because I know that managers would say, oh, that's really nice, but I'm busy. We're running a business.
Yeah.
So I've always been conscious of, how can I engage the business to understand what's important to them, to understand what they're trying to achieve, and to explore with them what might be getting in the way so that I can then provide them the right support. And so a lot of that is about using their language, being curious, taking an interest, and taking a holistic view of performance problems. And I just do the same thing now through that broader culture lens. And I think that's one of the benefits for me, is that culture's helped to broaden my perspective. And so the key bit for me around connecting it to strategy has been working with leadership teams to understand their strategy. Where are they now? Where do they want to be? What is it they need to deliver? What are the outcomes? And then, of course, working with them to say, now you know where you need to be, what you need to deliver. There's a key question you need to ask, and that is, are we fit for growth? Do we have the capacity to deliver what the strategy is asking of us? And when we start to ask those questions, we're talking about our culture. Is our culture fit for growth? Does our current culture represent the capacity that we need to deliver? And so that's the really clear connection for me between strategy and culture. And then, of course, we can do work with the leadership team to identify and to challenge them to commit to the aspirational culture that's required. And then we can work with them to diagnose the current culture. And then, of course, we've got a gap between how things get done today, how things need to get done in order to deliver. And, of course, we can then pull the three levers, and we can work with leaders to identify what are the interventions, the initiatives, the projects, quick win, longer term, that will allow them to start to drive that shift. And over time, embed and sustain the aspirational culture, and, of course, continue to evolve as the world around us continues to evolve.
Great. And I've got a question for you about fit for growth. We often hear that some changes that get implemented, there's a good percentage of them that some of them fail, some of them, are incomplete, and some of them succeed. Is that a reflection, or one reflection of how fit for growth or fit for change a culture is?
I think the short answer is probably yes, because we may have an intent to deliver something or achieve something, but then we have to have a look at what were all the enablers and the inhibitors. And if we weren't able to deliver something, then there's some aspect of our capacity that was missing, through that individual lens. Did our leadership have the capacity to deliver? Did we have the mindsets that we needed to deliver? Did we have the competencies, the behaviours, the decision-making? Through that social lens, did our ways of working enable us or hinder us? Did the quality of our relationships, our communication, our language, our stories, our beliefs, our rituals, and then structurally, did people have the systems, the processes, the tools and the strategies to deliver? And we can absolutely look at that through that cultural lens.
That's fantastic. And I really love that. And it just made me think a lot about the clients that I service in my capacity as a change and comms specialist, and to use that how as part of the change readiness is how fit for growth and fit for change is a culture that I need to look at before a big change or a big program to be rolled out.
No, thanks, Ali. And I think that's interesting. I think what you've just talked about there is an example for me of just the connections that I see and the overlap that I see. Evolving culture is change.
Yes.
And change is the evolution of culture. Any change project you work on is about evolving culture, I would think. So there's more in. They're effectively the same thing. And I, at the moment, I think about organisational development is cultural evolution, and employee experience is cultural evolution. So I'm sort of in this messy space at the moment, which I'm quite enjoying, where I'm just seeing all of these connections, and I suppose the opportunity for people like you and I is, how do we harness those connections so that we can be more effective and have greater impact and help others to do the same.
I think creativity happens when you are in the middle of a messy space.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it forces you to think and to question, and that's, you're right. We absolutely want that curiosity. It's the key to unlocking everything, I think.
Wonderful. Andrew, we've talked a bit about theory and concepts, but can you talk us through an example of how you've brought this all together?
Sure. And I won't pretend that we got it right. Whatever people might think right is, but I was fortunate in the last few years to have an opportunity to partner with a newly appointed executive leader in an organisation, and he was keen to form a global leadership team. And prior to this, there was no leadership team. They were certainly highly cooperative and working together on projects and initiatives. But the team had a challenging strategy agenda, and the executive general manager was very keen to empower a genuine leadership team. And in his words, he talked about the aspiration, and he wanted this leadership team to have a shared aspiration and a shared responsibility for growing the function, developing the function, and in addition to their technical role, their job title, their day job, if you want to talk about it that way. So I was able to work with the executive leader and go through a process of forming that leadership team. And in simple terms, we ran a series of offsites every 4 to 6 months, as well as having regular leadership team meetings. And as part of this work, when those meetings occurred, how they occurred, the agendas of those meetings, our operating rhythm were things that we constantly tweaked to make sure that they were fit for purpose. But the process that I was able to go through with this team, in our first offsite, we spent time focusing on strategy. We did a range of activities to focus on the purpose of this leadership team, the purpose of their function, to explore how they create value for the organisation. And importantly, given that this was a different space for many of the leaders, I wanted to make sure that they didn't feel threatened. So an important piece of building this awareness and commitment for the evolution and the work that we were going to do was to acknowledge the past. So it was important for me to help this team celebrate the success they'd had and the achievements that they'd had. And one of the simple ways we did that was not just getting them to capture their achievements, but getting them to focus on why were they successful? How were they successful? What were the sort of guiding principles, the key insights that come out of their success as things that we could carry forward? And in addition to that, we did work to air the voices of frustration and to identify cultural inhibitors. What are the things that make it difficult for you to achieve? And what are the things that when you think about the year ahead that are likely to make it difficult to achieve or cause frustration? So I did a range of activities that really sought to bring the group together, to help them form as a leadership team, but also to open them up about the need to evolve. Through that work, we were then able to translate the work that was done on strategy. I ran an activity where I worked with the group and took them through a the adaptive cultures framework that has the 5 different stages of cultural evolution, and we unpacked each of those stages to talk about the healthy and unhealthy aspects of each of those stages, to talk about what leadership looks like, what's safe and not safe to do, what's important to the organisation. And so we walked through a journey of cultural evolution, and as well as being a really engaging and interactive activity, the primary purpose of that was to then empower the leadership team to identify what culture they needed in order to deliver on their strategy. What was the aspirational culture? What was exciting to me, and something that I didn't expect, but it's come out every time I've run this activity, is that as we work through and talk about the different stages of evolution, the audience, the participants, are able to unpack the journey that the organisation's been on. They're able to share where we've come from, how we've grown, how things have evolved, why we do things the way we do, and importantly, they're able to share some of their frustration. So the activity itself brings more awareness and commitment to the need to evolve. As a result of that work, we made the team committed to some quick wins, some immediate priorities, and then over the next few months, we diagnosed the current culture. So we used the Adaptive Cultures diagnostic tool to get a better understanding of the current culture. And so that allowed us to explore themes like accountability and ownership, adaptability, learning and innovation, communication and collaboration, leadership and people, and organisational design, systems and processes. So we had a really strong baseline to work with. And then about 4 or 5 months after we'd formed, we then had another 2-day offsite where we did a range of developmental activities. But the primary purpose of that offsite was for the leadership team to identify the culture roadmap. And so using the results of the diagnostic and key insights, the leadership team worked in small groups and then came together to identify what are the interventions, the initiatives under each of the 3 levers of individual, social and structural transformation that are going to allow us to build our capacity to deliver on the strategy and build our capacity to respond to some of the headwinds and challenges we're likely to face. As a result of that work, I was able to take all of the inputs from the leaders and create what, if you work in HR, you might call it a culture roadmap. I was very careful not to overly use the term culture because of perceptions that leaders have. I think I'd done a good job of introducing the idea of culture as capacity. When I drafted the culture roadmap, we had a pillar around attraction, engaging and retaining our staff. We had a pillar around building capability. We had a pillar around systems and process, and we had a pillar around developing an effective leadership team. And when I fed it back to the leaders, the draft, I said, I know that we've talked about this as a culture roadmap, a people plan, but we've got this really strong pillar around systems and process. I'm not sure that people plan is a fit. And a really important moment for me was when one of the leaders in the team came forward and said, well, that's because it's a capacity plan. And from that point on, it was always referred to as a capacity plan. So now the team had a really clear strategy, and they had the work that they were doing day to day to deliver on that strategy. And we had a separate capacity plan that was all about building our fitness for growth, building our capacity to deliver, adapt and grow. And hopefully with those 4 pillars that I mentioned, you can see there's a range of initiatives across the 3 levers of individual, social and structural that we're able to work on. Most of those initiatives were actually owned by the members of the leadership team, not by me. So I played a role in a sense, project managing the capacity plan. I did some of the work with the team, some of the work for the team, and provided broader support to set them up. But the leaders owned most of those initiatives. And as a team, part of building our capacity was to do work together, to scope those initiatives, but then to trust each other to deliver on each other's behalf. And then part of our ongoing operating rhythm was that leaders, all of those initiatives in the capacity plan would be reported on a monthly basis. So it was a living plan. The leaders were accountable. If there were challenges, we would talk about it. If priorities changed, we would talk about it. And that's how we had a living capacity plan that was intimately connected to the strategy. And I guess in terms of the success of that, the plan itself did evolve because the world wasn't static. The business was changing and the environment was changing. So we did have to regroup and adapt that plan, evolve that plan. But in the 2.5 years that I worked with this leadership team, they achieved all of their targets and all of their key milestones. And the function grew. It took on additional responsibilities through that time as well. And interestingly for me, as an HR practitioner, we often worry that, what if we get asked, what the ROI is of our initiatives? I never got asked that question once. And I think the reason was because the plan was designed by the leaders for the leaders. They are the people that decided on the interventions and the initiatives, and they were the people that decided the value. So they never had to question me on the value because they had ownership and accountability. And they didn't question the connection between the initiatives, the plan, with their strategy. And so that was a really exciting process for me, and I feel really privileged to have been able to do that work. And I think I probably learnt the most out of anyone on that leadership team through that sort of 2.5 years of work.
That's a great example, Andrew, and I appreciate you shared It's almost, for our listeners, it's almost a whole framework that you just put there, right there in your answer. Well done. It sounds like it was an exciting time at that particular organization. Andrew, we're coming to the close of our podcast, and I'm really enjoying it, and I certainly have learned so much.
Thank you.
And what would you like to leave our listeners with in terms of last few words around adaptive cultures and why organizations would need to pay attention to them now?
I think I'm passionate about the potential of people and culture functions. I'm passionate about the opportunity for people like you and I, Ali, working in change, working in culture. We've got amazing opportunities. But the biggest challenge, if we're serious about this work, is that growth is painful. Growth is challenging. Growth is uncomfortable. And it's very easy for us to decide that we don't want to feel uncomfortable and to walk away. And we can do lots of busy work, but as a result, we'll never have anywhere near the impact that we can. What I found most challenging about this work and the path that I'm on is that I have to look inside myself. I have to do the inner work, because if I don't build my capacity to deliver, adapt and grow, then how can I help others to do the same? And, growth is painful. And what was quite challenging in this work, apart from, looking inside myself and seriously undertaking what we would talk about as vertical development, is the fact that when we're doing this work with leaders, they're not going to feel comfortable. So this work doesn't feel nice. The results are great, but we're creating a space of productive discomfort, and that takes a bit of getting used to. So a lot of this work around building adaptive capacity is creating a space that's safe, but ultimately is about providing heat experiences. It's about colliding perspectives, and it's about lots of reflection. And none of those things feel comfortable, but if we do it in the right way, if we do it in a productive way, then people will feel that they are growing, and they will feel that they're expanding their capacity, and they won't want to go back.
Yeah, productive discomfort. I love that. And I'm probably going to get you back on another podcast to really unpack that term, productive discomfort. I appreciate your time, Andrew. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I certainly have learned, and I'm sure our listeners would have picked up quite a few ideas out of this. At a personal level, I know how passionate you are about helping organizations, and I know that in our podcast, we're going to put all your contact details for anybody who's interested to reach out to you about this particular topic.
Ali, thank you so much for your time and for the opportunity. I'm really incredibly grateful, and just the opportunity to share and talk about these things helps me make more sense and gives me insights as well. So I certainly look forward to the ongoing conversation. And any of your listeners, please reach out. Would love to share ideas and insights with each other. It's it's the more perspective we can bring in, the more opportunities we have to grow. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Cheers, Ali. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode with Andrew Gerkens. To learn more about this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website. To receive more podcasts, simply subscribe. If you know a professional whose ideas are worth listening to, please let me know. In our next podcast, we will meet with another exciting guest who will share their thoughts and ideas on the science of organizational change. Don't miss that one. Until then, stay well and stay safe.